Hello and welcome to Uluwatu Aduba. I'm Kaneq Homme.
And I am Hieronymus. And we are discussing the first part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian epic tale and oldest discovered story in history. Along our journey, we'll use many different sources for our discussion, including myths and the Bible. So, we've been reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, and starting out, we're introduced to a few characters, most notably Shamhat the harlot, and Kidu, and the Anunnaki. So ancient Sumeria is in modern day Iraq. Back then, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers had a different path in what's now known as the Fertile Crescent, and it was a very lush farmland. And the cities there were noted for their big walls because there are no natural defenses there. And famously, the Ishtar Gate, which has been rebuilt in Germany, was a giant gate to go in and out of the city of Ur. Now, the city of Ur is where we get the words like urban from, or living in cities. But our story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, takes place in Uruk, which is north of Ur. And at this time, this is a very ancient time. It was a myth to the ancient Sumerians themselves. You have what's interesting is Gilgamesh is called a god king, but he was referenced as a demigod in the story, kind of like a Hercules, not a god itself. And the Anunnaki are very familiar to most people, a very Greek type of pantheon where they're very involved in the lives and goings ons of the Sumerians. So the story opens and it has the gods creating Enkidu after a council of sorts, and that's the impetus for the whole story is the development of Enkidu as an opposer to the god king of the city state of Uruk, Gilgamesh. In addition to the literary legacies and some of the later Babylonian Empire architectural legacies, we also are left with the ziggurats, which are huge stepped buildings where the royalty and religious sectors of life would reside at the top of. And it's not really noted that Uruk in the story has one of these ziggurats, but they were very common throughout the area as places of worship and power, seats of power. So, uh, Kaneq Homme, what do you have to say about this?
Well, I'm just reminded of all the times that I see the ziggurat in fiction and in like media. Like there's in the movie Metropolis, they have one. They have one in the I think they have it in the original Fritz Lang film. But did the Hanging Gardens also exist at the same time? Because that's what comes to my mind.
The Hanging Gardens were a later development when Nebuchadnezzar II was the king of late Babylon. So think of Sumeria the same way we think of Egypt, where you have high, middle, and low Egyptian kingdoms, or like early, middle, and late kingdoms. And this would be very early or very high kingdom Sumeria. So the Hanging Gardens hadn't been built yet. Again, the ziggurats aren't really mentioned in the story directly, and so maybe the bigger ziggurats weren't built at this time. This is a very early time, a primordial time in one of the more primordial civilizations of the Near East.
You mentioned the pantheon. And actually, I was thinking about just that. I was thinking, like, do the Greek, well, in order, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman pantheons like to correspond with the Sumerian one?
Yeah, there's the Ishtar, I believe, is the moon, and you have, gods of the moon and the sky and the harvest, and that they conspire with each other or against each other to, just like the Greek pantheon and the Egyptian. But they seem to be more involved in uh, people's lives. And we also actually have a very like Promethean creation myth where you have the men being created from soil, from clay, and some of these other themes in the Anunnaki. Now, it's not clear if they were contemporary to the other two pantheons or if they came first, but they carry a lot of similar motifs in their themes and personages with the other two pantheons.
I was wondering, like, when does the like, where does it come from? Like, because if the earliest periods are like right when, um, I guess prior to Noah or after, then I was thinking, like, because in the Greeks they added more. Like over time, like Heracles wasn't always a story. Like they had to add that in, and they like I think they were continuously adding in like new ones as the passing of time went on. So like, how did they do that? Like, why did they do that as well?
Well, this is the first story we have post flood and from the Bible. So this is the earliest one we found in writing. And a big factor in this book is the flood of at least the either the flood of the world or at least the flood of the Near East. And where they got it from, we don't really know. It's got some pretty eternal themes like Gilgamesh's quest for eternal life and the heroic epic. These are very common themes that show up later in Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology and those regions as well. But the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest tablet, if you read it by itself, it's very incomplete. It's not a very good read. That's why we're reading the standard version. It still has some of these like really base motifs.
I was speculating in my head, like whether they made it up originally out of imagination, or if they were based on real people. Like, because, like you said, like the gods are like very human, maybe not humanistic in terms of like treating people so good. I don't know, but humanoid, like not just humanoid, but like humanesque
They're
rather.
caricatures,
Like,
just like the Greek gods. They embody a certain aspect of humanity.
so it is
And
abstract. I was wondering if it was physical, like if they, because Odin is an example of a real man named Woden. About 800 or 1,000 years prior to his myth, he was a real guy, and he was like a real valiant guy. But just later on, they just um, messed up his story and then started
well,
calling a god named Odin.
just like George Washington to the American tradition, you can mythologize anybody and sort of take out their humanity and replace it with an idealized version of themselves or how a person should be. As far as the validity of the existence of the Anunnaki as people, that's unverifiable. So we don't have any way of seeing if the Anunnaki were actually real people at one time because this is so far in the past that we just don't have the corresponding literature or archaeological evidence to back it
But I
up.
was thinking the adding the gods, doesn't that indicate it doesn't have anything to do with like it being based on real people? Like, did Heracles exist or
Uh, Heracles existed. Hercules, that's the big one. We don't know about that. But it could be that these people, like Hercules' 12 great labors, that some of them could be real, some of them could be symbolic. And, maybe there were the 12-foot tall demigod like people, like the Gilgamesh or Hercules, who had supernatural strength. Or maybe they were given credit for like multi men accomplishments, like diverting rivers in the 12 Labors of Hercules, for example.
Kind of like how that actually reminds me of a Don Jolly in one like quotation in one of the theaters of the air, which is an like I guess post MDE project. In Theater of the Air, Don Jolly says that Superman embodies the like collective like desires and like building architecture projects of like the time when they were written, and like he would like build a dam in like 10 seconds. But anyhow, that's a side point. I was wondering if like they
That
if
is
any
similar.
yeah, I wonder if any gods like were added to the Sumerian pantheon at all.
That I'm not so sure. I'm not a big Anunnaki buff myself. I'm more about the story. But I do
Well,
know that the first dam in the world is actually now on a dry riverbed in Yemen, on the south of the peninsula. So we have the Great Walls of Ur that will be constructed. We have the ziggurats, and we have like the earliest dam in Yemen. So this is a time of these great things just starting to happen. And a big theme of the Epic of Gilgamesh is being remembered through your actions and being passed down culturally instead, because you can't be immortal unless you're a god.
well, there was two options that were in my head. In my head, I was thinking, I don't know if you've seen those Kent Hovind. I mean, I think you think that he's a charlatan, but him and others, they were like, making proofs about how the people in the past, the men, human beings in the past, used to be taller, used to be, used to be more oxygen in the air, and on, etc. So I think it's either the Nephilim, but maybe Nephilim correspond more to the Anunnaki, and then either that or the human beings are simply taller.
Well, you have the Nephilim, which were in the Bible the offspring of angels and human women. And Nimrod was in the area. If you read the Bible, he was around this area. And also, you have people like Agamemnon, who in Herodotus, his grave was found and dug up, and his skeleton was 10 feet tall. And then you have the giant sarcophagi underneath the catacombs of Cairo. So there is evidence that they were at least building things for big people. Uh, you know, they were building these huge tombs and they weren't finding piles of skeletons. So these sarcophagi in Egypt weren't being uh, constructed as a mass grave. And the other sarcophagi that we find later, they're all for only one person. In the tomb of Agamemnon, when they find that in Herodotus, they find one skeleton and it's 10 feet tall, and that's how they identify it as him. So, I mean, the giant myth is pretty widespread, but there's also evidence that people were building things, at least in death, for very large people that don't seem to exist today.
I'm inclined to believe. I'm further. I'm further inclined to believe that the people, just the common people, were taller, because like it's that whole narrative. I don't know if you know, but like certainly you know, but like all of these like archaeological people, like when they were discovering like giant skeletons other places in the world, like they tried to like tamper with evidence. They would bring it into a like an archive. They would like destroy it, or they would destroy evidence on the site, or they would obfuscate. And so I think this is a narrative, of course, to continue the narrative that human beings are constantly evolving, that we were never larger, that somehow that it's not going from up to down, that it's going from down to up. So I think, given that kind of resistance, we can pretty much, in my mind, it's guaranteed that they were bigger.
Well, the at least in the one verified historical document, and I know it's arguably verified, but I'm just going to take Herodotus at his word. He's pretty reliable. Well, Agamemnon in the Iliad was uh, noted for his size, so at least there he was tall. And we have Uh, Goliath from the Bible, noted for being taller as well.
But his whole tribe, his
Yeah,
whole tribe was named after, or they were all under the same tribe. They were all
yeah.
like
So we
collectively.
have we have either notable people or groups of people who were noted for their height. And, like the Dutch used to be noted for their height as well. So, and I mean, what I think the average height of a Dutchman was like what 6'2", when everyone else was like 5'11" or like 5'10". So they were very. That's a big difference, even those few inches. So, and people used to exaggerate more in the past how the difference between people as well. So there could have been people that were bigger and taller back then. That is true, but also you have to remember Sumeria is the first true agricultural center, and there they developed agriculture uh, notably first. That much of their writing is actually logistics or recording crop harvests and other things like that. So that could have had an effect on their stature as well, because you don't get as much nutrients from barley harvesting, especially at this time when they were like genetically engineering. They were the first ones to engineer wheat.
Yeah. Going back to uh, the pantheon, another thought that came to my head was how they were all a family. Like that's like a notably like human base kind of thing. Like for instance, Enkidu doesn't have a family, but like he's ostensibly the family of the gods, and the gods
Well, he
they
weeps, and Kidu weeps because Gilgamesh points out that he's basically an orphan bastard of the wilds. And then Kidu breaks down and cries because he doesn't have a family. And Gilgamesh, his like main go-to person is his mother, who is like his top advisor. Like we have his mother talking to us directly, and then the council of elders of the city is just the council of elders.
I'm kind of confused. Is the mother just got like courted with a god, or was she like a god?
She was like a priestess type thing.
Then how was the what was the other side? Who was the other side of that?
It's he's supposed to be like divinely born.
Which god in the pantheon did that, I wonder?
That is a good question. I don't know if there's one explicitly stated in the because in the second book when they are describing Gilgamesh, a lot of those tablets haven't been found, and at least in our version.
Oh, so they would definitely like include those details in there.
Possibly, I'm not gonna. We don't know because the Gilgamesh is set up as the antagonist in the first half. It's a really good story because it changes. There's character development and the plot develops at the same time. It's a really well written story for being the oldest written story.
Well, I think there were definitely stories before it.
Well, this is the first written one we discovered.
Hmm.
So that's the big thing is this was an oral tradition that was we knew it existed because it was still an oral tradition after they stopped doing it for a while, after they stopped writing it down for a while. So we knew there was something out there, and then we rediscovered the tablets. It confirmed it, and we have it again today after the tablets are pulled up. So as far as the gods, I mean, they. I think it's funny that Gilgamesh pretty much has dominion over Uruk, and then one of the other gods is just so mad that he's practicing prima nocta uh, that just makes Enkidu to get him to stop doing that. I think that's a pretty good moral
That's
imposition.
another thing that I was thinking about. I was thinking about like whether or not they thought that harlotry was wrong, like because you have Shamhat, you have the at the temple, uh, or the what do they call it in the book? It's like it's either the temple like wherever the mother is, like I think there were nearby the priestess, there were just like some harlots, like
Well, they
did
say the
they?
two oldest professions were developed in Sumeria, and the two oldest of those being baking and prostitution, of course. So you had one guy with
Well,
an oven who would churn your barley into bread, and then you had the woman who would sell her body. And I mean, in the interactions between Shamhat and the people in the sticks wherever she was living, they didn't really seem to pay big attention to her being a prostitute, right?
it kind of it reminds me of several things. It reminds me of Scythian culture. In Scythian culture, like I'm pretty sure if I'm not wrong, if I'm not quoting this correctly, they said they shared everything except for their wives. So like even and I think maybe in some sections of that they there was some deviousness. I'm not sure in which one of those civilizations, but um like it reminds me of the like that is to say that I would imagine that people would naturally go towards fidelity because it's like nobody wants to be cheated on. Like,
That's true, but this is also traditionally you had to give dowries for your daughters. So if you were a daughter to a man who couldn't afford a dowry, you were worth less on the marriage market, and that could be the only way
I
that
have
you could.
Herodotus section, histories by Herodotus section right here where it talks about that.
This is the town where the women were prostitutes till they made their own dowry and they married
No,
off.
this one is in book one. It's talking about the marriage, literally the market. It's in Babylon, which is well, I mean, how far was Babylon from Ur? Ur?
You can see it on the map I have up there. It's a fair bit north, but it's on the same river, so not too far away.
Shall I read it?
Sure.
Okay. This is section 196, page 97, if that matters to anyone.
Oh, what's the book version?
The book version is new translation, Tom Holland. Um,
And
it's
the year it was
book one.
published.
It was published in 2013.
There we go. Okay.
2013. This is section 196, page 97, book one. The one that I myself rate the cleverest is one that they share with the Ineti, the one being the one cultural practice. A people from Illyria, so I have learned. Wait, it's not the right one? Hold on. No, it's not the right one. No, here's the Babylonian custom. Once in her life, now this is 199 by the way. Once in her life, every native born woman must go and sit in the shrine of Aphrodite and have sex with a total stranger. Those whose sense of pride has been so puffed up by wealth that they disdain to mingle with the other women there will invariably be driven to the sanctuary in a carriage and pair, veiled behind curtains, and when they do have to stand in the open, a whole retinue of servants will be massed in attendance behind them. These, however, are the exceptions. Most will sit in the temple precinct with a garland of plaited string around their heads, and everywhere there are women arriving and women leaving. Gangways, dead straight ones, provide access through the mass of them in a whole range of different directions, and it is along these up and down that men who have never before so much as seen the woman will go and make their pick. No woman who has sat herself down there is permitted to go home until a stranger has tossed a silver coin into her lap and led her outside the shrine there to have sex with her. The man who drops the coin must say, as he does so, I summon to your protection the goddess Mylitta, Mylitta being the Assyrian name for Aphrodite. The coin itself can be of any value. There is no denomination so small that it can be legitimately refused, for the silver, merely by being dropped, has been transmuted into something holy. Similarly, the woman has no right to pick and choose. She must go with the first man who pays her. The moment she has sex with him, however, she has fulfilled her obligation to the goddess and can head home, and from that moment on there is no payment, be it ever so great, that will enable someone to get their hands on her again. Good-looking, statuesque women, of course, do not have to wait long to get home, but those who are less pleasing to the eye can find themselves unable to meet the requirement of the law for quite a while. Some, indeed, have been left stranded for up to 3 or 4 years. In Cyprus too, there are several places where an almost identical practice is followed. End quote.
Yeah, so that's
And
Assyrian. So I don't know if the Assyrian uh, religion was exactly the same as this, because this is really ancient Sumeria. This is like Jason and the Argonauts, like but before, like 1,000 years before that happening in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So I don't even know if there were enough people for that to be viable at this time, but there was prostitution.
like I just was brought it was brought to my mind like all the different treatments of this, right? Because in Herodotus, he basically, as far as I can tell, as far as I've read, he takes a the histories, by the way, the histories. He takes a sort of neutral position on it, as far as I can tell, which seems kind of strange to me, but that's what I got. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it also seems to be just like casual, like, oh, Chamhat, the harlot. Oh yeah, and here's the temple, and by the way, there's harlots. It's like, um, where do these women come from? Do they just get taken from their homes? Like, where do they
Well,
do
this
it
is a
willingly?
very labor intensive economy, and all the men are either they're either named characters, they have jobs, or they're someone's dad. Okay, there's nobody in here. There's no man in here that isn't described by either his job or his fatherhood, and there's no woman in here that's not described by her motherhood or as a harlot, basically. So this is a very as you need it sort of reality. So I imagine if they're not being married off to be mothers, that's their next viable source of life. But
It,
there's a whole litany of Sumerian poetry dedicated to how nice it is to have a wife and kids and just work and be a good person. It's not like the whole every woman was a prostitute. There were plenty of good families, but prostitutes tend to make the headlines more than the woman who stays at home and tends to her family, at least historically.
so was it sort of like a decadence thing where like the common people didn't like it, but it was happening?
No, they didn't mind it because it's like they don't want to see them starving, but they need to do something. They don't want there was no socialism. I mean, there's no social safety net back then. And if you're going to work all day, and the Tigris and Euphrates were very rough places to farm because they flooded a lot. And it was really hard work to get this barley ready. And it was not, nothing came very easy. I mean, the one guy was just a hunter, and he spent all day hunting, and poor Gilgamesh was over there guarding the gazelles like as a beast of a man.
You
He's
mean
a,
Enkidu?
oh yes, Enkidu, I'm sorry. Enkidu was over there with the gazelles as a beast of a man, and they finally had to get they hired like they basically got a prostitute to come out. I don't know if they hired her, but they convinced her to come out and like tame. And this is a very another big mythological theme is the woman taming the man through this sexual act. So he's happy to be out in the wild before he meets a woman.
What comes to my mind, when you just said right there whether she was paid or not, like I was just listening to um Gato's uh John Taylor Gato's video about money, and uh like he says that like something he quotes Simmons, who says that like the value of something decreases as soon as it has to be paid for it, right? So like, and that's especially for prostitution, like as soon as like it's like mercantile, as soon as it's like transactional, like uh the value goes down. It's sort of like he um he mentions in America's the only place where they one of the only places where they charge for blood, where blood is a market rather than just being given. And America has the lowest blood quality, uh, out of all the different out of all the blood of every country. Anyhow, so like I think even though Shamhat, may be treated sort of neutrally in the story, I think, essentially, in essence, it's still a like degraded thing. It's still a degraded experience on both parts.
I mean, I think if you look at it through a modern Christian morality, yeah, but this is a like a very different world where, like, if you didn't have a dowry, if you couldn't secure a husband for your daughter, there weren't a lot of options. And I don't think people were too hard on these people because it was a small community as well. And it wasn't like these were people from the very fringe, like modern America. This was ancient Samaria. There weren't a whole lot of people, just period.
Should I quote the Illyria quote because it talks about selling wives on the market, and it's it's similar to what you've been talking about.
All right, this will be the last point on ancient prostitution for today.
Okay, shall I read it?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, this is the 196. Yeah. The one that I myself rate the cleverest is one that they share with the Aneti, a people from Illyria. So I have learned. Once a year in every village, this was the scene that would be staged, an assembling of all the girls who had ripened into the full bloom of marriageability. These would then be led in a great throng to a given spot, where a crowd of men would stand around them in a ring. One by one, an auctioneer would raise the girls to their feet and put them up for sale, starting with the most attractive, and then, once she had been sold for a good price, moving on to whoever was next on the scale. It should be pointed out that the girls were being bought as wives. So that's the distinction. It's like I think this is a better example than maybe the prostitution. Um, all the rich Babylonians who were in the marriage market. So yeah, this is Babylon here, by the way. All the rich Babylonians who were in the marriage market would bid furiously against one another for the beauties, while those who were less well off, men who did not demand good looks in a wife, would end up being paid to take the plainer girls. This was because, once the auctioneer had run through the sale of the prettiest lots, he would haul the ugliest girl up to her feet, or even a cripple if there was one, and auction her off by asking who would accept the smallest amount of money in exchange for taking her as his wife, and whoever accepted the lowest figure would duly get her. The funds for this came from the sale of the attractive girls, thereby ensuring that it was those with good looks who served to provide dowries for their ugly or crippled sisters. It was forbidden a man to arrange a marriage of his daughter on his own whim, nor was anyone who had purchased a girl permitted to take her home without first producing someone prepared to stand surety for him. End quote.
Now, when
So
when you're talking about the Assyrian markets or Herodotus, that's their third or fourth century BC. Okay, that that market to the time of Gilgamesh is like comparing modern America to like Roman England in terms of time scale.
I'm not trying to make a direct comparison. I'm just trying to like this had to come from something. So like it probably like it's like a zeitgeist.
I think that shows like that there was more prosperity, so men could even
Hmm.
afford to auction wives. I don't think people in ancient Sumeria really could afford to have these things because you had the aristocracy with like the elders in the city, you had Gilgamesh on top, but even the people who were married still had to were subjected to prima nocta before Enkidu came into the city. So this is like these people are not living under very good conditions, and even the gods, the Anunnaki, like acknowledge this and try to rectify something that they can. I'm just saying these are not prime. Like the deluge had happened recently in the book. You have like God-made horrors in Lebanon, ancient and modern day Lebanon, surrounded by giant cedar trees. You had bulls of heaven that people didn't even know how to kill bulls yet in the book. I think I think you're just judging that too harshly, and also they needed people. There weren't a lot of people on Earth at this time. Even by modern scientific estimates, like the people numbered in like the tens of millions around when this was written. or like the hundreds of millions worldwide.
Mm, I wasn't trying to say that it's exactly the same. I was just trying to bring in some comparative examples.
Oh, I agree. But I think I just think those are not. I think we have a hard time comprehending the ancient world because of how few people there were. Like, the Uruk itself is probably tens of like maybe 10,000 people. That was a big city. And then Babylon of the biblical times was like 100,000 people, and that was a metropolis. Like a million people had not been like I don't think anything got to a million until the Aztecs when they had like just better sanitation because they lived on a lake, so they could afford that kind of infrastructure. And then so I think it's really crazy to think about this ancient time and how people lived and how few people there were.
Would that increase the amount of prostitution or decrease it? Because like I would think that having less people would mean that they would kind of like be more sparing and like have everyone be married instead of
There's
having
less
prostitution.
people, there's less wealth to go around, and like you can build like a small hut. And actually, in modern Iraq, I think it's still there, but they lived in reed longhouses at the time as family units, and you need a husband and a wife to make a family unit. So until a man could afford to afford a I don't know, to buy a prostitute out of the life, or until a father could afford to buy a dowry for his son or for his daughter, they weren't really getting married because it was a big deal because you're sharing space. There wasn't unlimited space to build things. In cities like Uruk and Ur, they had planned city lots where you had to like get people together to build your house with you. And if you were just like a 19-year-old or a 15-year-old, I guess at the time, man, like a very young man entering the workforce, and you were like a young woman entering the workforce because your parents couldn't afford to feed you for, you know, without you working or doing something productive, that does generate prostitution. And these very like people were like cities would be wiped out through droughts, right? There was no way to just have enough money to, or enough gold or enough currency of any kind to save you from starving because there weren't enough people to work all the land to get enough food to have a big uh, stockpile like there was in um, other surrounding civilizations after. But even then, like Egypt still had famines. Greece still had famines for a very long time. So I mean, these are very, very rough times to live.
Like the Bible story with Joseph, where he makes special effort about that particular topic.
Yeah, but Egypt then is like 10 times the size of Samaria in this story, or maybe 100 times. So you had the manpower, literally the manpower, to farm the whole Nile or huge sections of the Nile. And the Tigris and the Euphrates were longer than the Nile, but because of the way that the city-state structure that was set up, it wasn't a national structure until Babylon. When Babylon, that was the big thing, was it united all the city-states of Mesopotamia or ancient Sumeria. Sumeria was just a cultural term for the people that lived there who were culturally similar or ethnically similar with the same culture, but they were governed very independently, unlike Egypt in the Bible, for instance.
So what, like city states?
Yeah, they were all city states in Sumeria. And Ur became the most powerful, but the one in this city is Uruk, and that is where Gilgamesh lived, and that's where this started.
Are there any similar stories, like, or maybe after this one, or any stories at all in Ur? Because Ur is where Abraham came from. So that I wonder if they have any stories over there in
Again,
Turkey.
When Ur's time was maybe like 1,000 or 1,500 or even 2,000 years after this story, and that's when the civilization of Babylon, like the national power of Babylon, was in effect, and that's where the capital was. And if you look at the map, you see Ur, uh, like there's a, the modern coast is further out than where these cities were, and that's because Ur was probably on the ocean, and the um oh, I forget the name of it, but when like the river deltas and everything were being developed, the depositing from the Tigris and Euphrates hadn't reached out that far into the Persian Gulf. It was also a port city at that time, probably as well.
Something that I had thoughts on, like you said before. You said how Enkidu was a wild man. I was having some thoughts before about how like the shepherd archetype, how he is a shepherd, but strangely enough, he's like also like sort of eats grass and drinks at the watering hole. So, in in the symbolic sense, he's both the sheep and the shepherd. What do you?
But
What are?
he was totally a wild animal. He was not a man at all. And that was the big thing. He couldn't speak until he spent time with Shamhat the harlot. She cultured him. Without her, he would not know anything other than being an animal in his
That's another thing
existence.
that I was thinking about. I was thinking about like how did he know to the words to speak when the people came around? Like, did he just was he like intrinsically given language, or
No,
did
He
he?
didn't know he was a wild man, and then like I believe in the story it's a week with Shamhat, but it's not. It's implied that they laid together, but that doesn't mean they just had intercourse for a week. They could have like it's implied that she's through like a symbolic intercoursal act. She's also teaching him how to speak and how to be rational. And that's why after this week of intercourse, um,
It says, and he was expanded in wisdom.
yeah, and then he goes back to the animals. The animals knew that he wasn't just another animal anymore, and they disown him. And
Oh, so you're
so
saying in some psychic sense, the animals knew that like that his knowledge was expanded, that his mentality was
it's
different.
like a yeah, it's like a psychic or a spiritual recognition of the animals that he's like no, like he is now a real man, and they should fear him. Whereas before, he was like an animal, like spiritually or psychically, and he was not like it's like Tarzan. You know, Tarzan is a similar thing where he's he's an English royalman, and he's dropped a plane crashes in the jungle, and he's raised by gorillas, and they accept him. And then when he spends time with Jane and gets civilized, he's rejected by the gorillas. Then he goes back and resumes being a aristocrat in England. It's the same kind of story.
That's based on the on a real story, right? Isn't it?
I don't know if that's based on a real story, but the author's point in that story was that royal blood always commands. So even though he was a wild man as an ape, he was still recognized for being like more royal.
Yeah, nature over nurture, but not only nature over nurture, nature over nature nurture. So nature nurtured him, but nature nature went above that.
Yeah, and that's with Gilgamesh. You see that as him as like the protector of the flocks. Not Gilgamesh. I'm sorry, Enkidu. He was like the protector of the flocks, and he ate the grass with the gazelles, and he was just wild. And then he gets an education through Shemhat the harlot, which again they're not really demeaning her for being a harlot. She's the only one who could bring him in. The other men couldn't corral him. They had to bring
Yeah, they
in the
said,
harlot.
do not go with him with might. That's what
Yeah,
I think that's what it says in the book.
Yeah.
Do not
So
rely on the strength of a man. Yeah, I think it's do not rely on the strength of a man.
yeah, and he finds his equal in Gilgamesh. So it's like you have the wild man, and then you have the literal god of civilization, and they're evenly matched. And they find a little bit of each other in each other, and they become really good friends.
Hmm. Do they also? Does it represent when you say that, find a little bit in each other? Is that like are the two supposed to represent like the duality of man or something like that?
I don't know the duality of man. I don't know if it's that like kind of concept, but there is a duality of something in there.
Because
I yeah.
Enkidu is hairy, but so is um so is Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, they the hair descriptions are the same. They
Well, the
say
hair is a measure
his
of
hair was as thick as barley. For Enkidu, they say the hair is as thick as barley. So like
yeah.
it's like I think maybe on a like meta, what do you call it? Maybe on a macro sense, it's like duality of man kind of thing.
Well, the hairiness used to be a sign of virility, so it was a sign of being like full of life. If you're more hairy as a man, so
And
that's
that reminds me of like something I actually wrote down was the tribe of Reuben. The tribe of Reuben's banner, heraldry, crest, if you will, was the primordial man, also called the primal man. What do you think connection there is?
there's probably a lot of connection. I mean, there wasn't uh, um, to go more biblical in ancient Jewry, ancient Hebrew mythology. There was a lot of crossover with the more heretical in the Bible, the heretical beliefs of like the um, Jews in the time of the judges and everything like that, where they were falling to polytheism and their surrounding states. And that was a big issue. And you know, they spent time in Babylon, and they brought back a lot of like worship and imagery from Babylon at the time too. So just keep that in mind. There is a lot of overlap, culturally at least. So
How much would there have been like when the tribes are being founded, right? Because the symbols, the crests, the banners, they would literally like each hold a banner and like stay in like 12 different throngs. They would each stay in like
yeah, no, I know what
12
you're talking about.
functions.
So maybe that inspired the Sumerian ideal. It could be, but I don't have a date or a timeline for the 12 tribes leaving Israel and the Epic of Gilgamesh. I don't have that
No, no, no. I
timeline.
mean like when they were born, because like certainly, certainly the symbols had to come up from like the patriarchs themselves, the 12 or no.
Yeah, and there's also, I mean, the Bible and the Epic of Gilgamesh have certain like timeless symbols in them. Uh, so that's not totally out of left field either, because there was cross like there was trade between the kingdoms. You know, Israel's not that far away from Samaria, all things considered, and it's a pretty straight walk across the desert. But also the Tigris and Euphrates, those go up north there to the north of the Levant in modern day Lebanon, where part of the story takes place, and also Syria. So it's not crazy to think that there was also cross pollination that way as well.
Well, I think since Abram came from Ur, I think, and obviously there were more stories than just Gilgamesh. So I think the primordial man, I think that probably came from there.
It could have been. I mean, I'm not gonna say definitely, but I'm not gonna say that that's impossible either. You know.
What do you have to say about the him being a shepherd boy, like being because the shepherd is sort of like an archetype on in of itself.
Yeah.
Like, how do you think Enkidu what he has to do with the shepherd archetype?
Well, I think it says a lot that he was part of the flock, right? Like he wasn't just a shepherd; he was literally like part of a herd, who was then brought into being a shepherd. So he was from the wild. He learned the ways, and then he became a shepherd after learning the ways of man. It's a total development of who he is as a character in the book.
Because there's yeah, I suppose this development, but I was thinking more like David and Jesus and other like the shepherd idea is like it's a whole thing. Like
It
I'm
is,
thinking
yeah.
maybe thinking that maybe had also some osmosis as well.
It could have some osmosis, but also, I mean, Gilgamesh as a shepherd. If you think biblically, the shepherd archetype biblically, looking after people, Enkidu is so pissed off. He's so angry at Gilgamesh for enacting prima nocta that he decides to go to Uruk, the sheepfold, and look after those people because Gilgamesh is abusing them.
You know what? That now I'm just thinking about it now. He even though he's a wild man, or at least you know, categorically is a wild man. I mean, yeah, he got shaved by the barber, but like he's still categorically the same man. Like he does the most moralizing, I'm pretty sure, in the whole thing. Like he tells Gilgamesh, no, don't go do like he gives him warning, do not go to Humbaba. Like he goes against Primanati. Like if he was merely I think he it does represent a voice of reason, like with that shepherd archetype, but also as like reason and rationality as well.
Yeah,
Because
he's a very
if he was
yeah
simply a wild man, he would just not care. Oh, you're gonna do that? Yeah, do whatever. Law of the jungle. But he doesn't. He's very moralistic.
well, even in this story, the oldest written story discovered, you have the non-urbanite versus the urbanite. You have the very
Ah,
not just country
it's
boy,
literally them country folks.
not just
Them
country
country
folk, but
folks.
literally the animals in the country. Somebody who was raised by them having more common sense than the king of the
Dude,
castle.
straight up city slickers.
Yeah,
Like Inkita's literally like, you city slickers, we out here in the country, we do things different.
yeah.
Like
He's like
literally
you.
like
You're
that,
mighty.
but
You're
like,
mighty fine, but you don't know that Humbaba's gonna kill you. He's crazy.
dang, dude, that is such a direct analogy right there.
But even at this time, even I think it's 5,000 years old. Even when they wrote it down in 3000 BC, it's still it's still the same archetype.
Dude, Southerners would like it. Southerners, it would click with them real good. Like if they read the Epic of Gilgamesh, they'd be like, yeah, like it would fit perfectly.
Yeah, well, it's also you have the Romulus and Remus raised by wolves, and their wisdom makes Rome. It's not a city builder builds a a big city. It's a people from the wild suckled by wolves make Rome.
Yeah, more organic. It's more primordial. It's like
But it's the roots of the civilization don't lie in civilization or anything. It's a natural thing. The roots are
yeah, it
laid
doesn't
very
rely on
strongly down.
cleverness. Yeah, it
Yeah,
doesn't rely on cleverness and like technicality,
yeah.
which is actually just a very Theodore Kaczynski kind of thing. Like he says that the like he that technicians, like people who exist just to like do technical things, like that is a like unnatural thing.
But even at this time, my argument is even at this time, before anybody could be arguing, and also, however you feel about Ted Kaczynski, his argument against the like modern industrialized world. Here we have a literal fight between nature and society, a literal fight. Gilgamesh and Enkidu wrestle with each other, and Enkidu's like, "What you're doing in this city is wrong." And he's never even been there before. It's the first day he's there, and he's already pointing out things that are wrong that people are doing. the abuses of power of the
And
king.
though he is like in some sense, or perceivedly in some low sense, like low to down to the earth, literally down to earth, down to the ground, like even so, he is in actuality like high-minded. He's looking above it all. He's looking at the whole city, and he's like he's making, yeah, he's like he's picking out this is wrong. Like
Yeah.
it is like that.
So yeah, like if you that's like the that's that's why it's such a good story because there's so many small little things. It only a few tablets really. We've only read through like what 10 tablets, but and with the repetition of the writing style, there's still so much said. It's so good. It's so good.
Yeah, with redundancy and all. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the redundancy does play a part in it because, like you said, it describes. Uh, and you also have to remember this was an oral tradition as well. They were writing this down for people to tell other people so they could recite it orally. And repetition is a big part in oral stories. And like you said, though, like it made you remember that they described the hair on both of Enkidu and Gilgamesh as thick as barley. So it works. It's not for nothing.
No, you mean like the literary devices?
The repetition, the literary device of repetition, helped you remember
Well, in this
the
case,
allegory.
that would not be a repetition. That would be a parallel. Be a parallelism.
No, they also repeat it though, like 3 times each time, so you remember
Oh
it.
well, sure. I think in terms of like the two characters, it's like parallelism,
It
but
is between the two. It is,
yeah.
but you also they also repeat it multiple times each time they
Mm,
bring it up, so you
mm.
remember it. So when you have to re recite it orally, you remember it more easily. That's all.
That is true. Whenever I've like I would do calligraphy, and if I would do a certain portion, I'd be writing it. I would end up, I mean, naturally, uh, like going over the lines again and again and again in the process of writing it, such that I could recite it later, even though all I had done was write it. I could recite it later perfectly.
Yeah, as
Like I
somebody
could.
who's learned Chinese, that's like 90% of learning the written language is repetition. There's no substitute for it as well. But that's calligraphy as well, I guess. So, tit for tat on that. Do you have another point you want to bring up?
Yeah. One thing was the the mighty as a rock, mighty in strength as a rock from the sky. I didn't. I may have asked this before, but I don't know. I forgot. What does that mean?
Uh, in mythology, I mean, meteor strikes are pretty memorable even today, and there were meteor strikes in the past. The past has more frequently recorded natural disasters, including meteor strikes, than modern times. And there were a lot of meteor strikes in the area. I believe there is a gem on a Egyptian king's crown. Don't quote me on that, but it's a meteorite gem. So it was like a crazy rare gem because it came from another planet. But meteor strikes were very well known at the time.
Did they ascribe it to the gods?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
What did they? How did they characterize them?
It's wrath because it's a very violent thing. It's not very benevolent to hurl a rock at somebody, much less a god to throw it down from heaven onto somewhere.
Oh, so you're saying they interpreted it, they, because of its forceful nature, it was interpreted that way. Because we interpret them as basically as an act of random chance, as basically uh like as sort of like very mathematically, very statistically, we recognize them as like, oh, they come about this rate, and they go this speed, and like That's how we look at it, I guess, modern times.
We're also detached from the land. Look at the map of Sumeria. So you have the Fertile Crescent there. You have, Israel up to the mountains at the north, down to the Persian Gulf. That was all soft, arable land. So if a meteor hit there, it messed up your farmland and created like a new lake. And then the Arabian desert's there. If a meteor hits there, it turns all the sand into glass around it. Then it leaves a big hole. So, and if it clings into the mountains, no one cares. Or if it goes into the ocean, there's a tidal wave and it messes up all your ships. So there's no good place for any of this. If you're living there, you're hoping it goes north and east, so you don't have to worry about it because it's in the mountains. And if it landed anywhere near you, the destruction would be so palpable because you depend on this land that you know, that you travel on, that can only be the wrath of the gods.
Um, Strength as mighty as rock from the sky. They repeat that. They repeat that many times. They repeat that many times in the book.
Well, there could have
Like,
been
did they ever do anything else other than jewels with it?
with meteorite rocks, no, because it's just a rock. Like sometimes there's gemstones in meteorites, but that's about it.
How did they interpret it cosmologically?
If there was a big shooting star, they would ascribe something to it, like a figure moving across the sky. Like maybe they had a different word for Halley's Comet back then. I'm not a big expert on ancient astrology, but the you had shooting stars, but you have to remember also at this time the Milky Way was visible every night. There was no night where you couldn't look up at the sky and see all the stars, except maybe at a very bright full moon. I mean, you could see the planets with the naked eye in the middle of the city. There was no light pollution at the time either. So I'm sure it had some significance. I'm sure if you look in interpretations, astrological interpretations, you can see it, but I don't know the
Oh, that
exact
reminds
way.
me. It reminds me. I've been listening to a lot of stuff from Robertson Jenis and others about like geocentrism and Copernican principle. What was the Sumerian belief about the Earth?
It was more ancient Chinese. They're the they're the world type thing. It was very limited in its scope. I don't think they went into
Forms or anything? No forms.
in this book. I'm not a ancient Sumeria expert. Or an expert of anything really, but I more know about the epic itself than ancient Sumeria. But I know in the book there's nothing bigger ascribed to it than where you could walk to, because the whole book's about them walking to certain places. I mean,
What's the
they
what's
walked to
the
Pakistan.
significance of what's the significance of him like going through the mountain? Wait, should we spoil this? Uh, maybe
We
maybe
can
we should leave
spoil it.
that for
It's
the
it's
next.
been 6,000 years. If you haven't read the book
Sorry,
yet,
guys. Spoiler warning.
yeah.
Spoiler warning. Yeah, he goes to the. Maybe we should leave that for the next
I mean, I
conversation.
just said he walked to Pakistan, so they walk all the way to Pakistan, modern day Pakistan. So
In
they
the south
obviously
or in the north? Does
uh,
does Gilgamesh go north or south?
in the middle, kind of. They go to an ancient city that was it's now demolished, but there was an ancient city on the in the border, not on the border, but on the banks of the river there to meet Noah in the story. So
Is that closer to Mount Ararat or no?
no, it's far away. I mean, no, he references Mount Ararat, but in the epic, he's given eternal life by the gods, and Gilgamesh is like he wants to get eternal life. He's jealous because he wants to live forever. And Noah's like, no, like they promised me eternal life for listening to them, so I did it.
Is that the like is that like a Faustian spirit kind of thing, like the same kind of like civilized society versus like primordial, like the search for eternal life? Isn't that always like a like technical, very like
It's not really
conceited, like
Faustian. It's much more like Gilgamesh is a tyrant, and he's nervous that like his people will forget him. So he has Prima Nocta to secure his genetic legacy. And the gods correct him, saying like that's not a way to secure immortality as a mortal, because people there's no guarantee that even if you have 1,000 children they'll exist forever. And so then he meets Enkidu, who stops him from this practice, and then he goes to perform acts like killing Humbaba, and he realizes that's not good enough for something I won't spoil. And then he goes to uh, biblical, like in the Bible, he's called Noah, but he has another name, much longer Sumerian name,
Wait, should I say?
Utanapishti.
Yeah.
He goes to Utanapishti, and Utanapishti says, I can't guarantee you eternal life. It's not for mine to grant. It's only for the gods. And he realizes that by uh, trying to achieve eternal life, he achieves it through his actions. And that's like the only way is to. It's the Benjamin Franklin argument. Either do something worth writing down or write something worth reading. There's only two ways to immortality.
Benjamin Franklin in himself is sort of like a mythical figure as well, like because he did so many things. I mean, this speaks to what you were just saying. Like, he literally did so many things. Like the number of things ascribed to him are like what, like I don't even remember. There's so many. Like so
Flying the kite
he
in the electric storm. Yeah.
not just that, but like he made like a ton of inventions. I don't know if you know, but he made a ton of inventions. Uh and like so many things have his legacy. So he really did live out that you'll be known by your live forever by your actions, because like Benjamin Franklin, like as a person but also in his actions, like is basically immortal. Like he's like a mythical figure.
Yeah, and he's also a foundational figure, just like Gilgamesh is. For I mean, you Saddam Hussein, when he was trying to mythologize himself, he had frescoes made of him shaking hands with Gilgamesh.
Yes, yes, yes.
So it's the same kind of founding mythology in America as it is with Gilgamesh. And it's a big theme because impermanence, sorry, was a big theme in Sumerian literature as well, and poetry, where the floods would come and wash away your work, and you would do a lot of work every year, and it would get reset when the Tigris and Euphrates overflowed, this type of thing.
So you're saying like their minds were conditioned, their zeitgeist was basically molded by like these cycles, such that like it became their thinking.
Ironically, because they were uh, an urban agricultural civilization, this gave them an impermanent mindset, more so than the hunter gatherer Scythians or um, other cultures around them. And they saw their work. They worked really hard every year, but nature would take their work away. And they would have to work really hard again to get the rewards. Whereas in other cultures, you live off the land, you live off the wildlife, and it's just a constant thing you do. You always hunt, you always move, but in a agricultural, civilizational, permanent society, like you're what you see the world change around you. You don't move enough, I guess, to ignore those
Was it the
changes.
same with the Egyptian? Because the Egyptians had lots of floods too.
Yeah, I mean, it was the same. I don't know about the Egyptians took to mount to monument building more for that reason. I don't know about the Egyptian poetry or anything, the writings, if they were so forlorn about the state of labor like the Sumerians were. The Sumerians have a lot of poems about how they work all day, and they're like, it sucks, but also it's nice because you get to enjoy these things. So who knows?
I think that's mostly all that I had to think of.
Oh, and also they have, unlike the Bible, where wine is a drink that is substituted for like a lightly fermented grape juice or something like that. And Kidu drinks barley, and not barley, I'm sorry, he drinks ale made from barley. And a big part of life in the Fertile Crescent was drinking ale because the process to make beer and bread is closely related. So they're both easy to make with what they produce, and they both have similar nutrient value. So a lot of this civilization was based on the consumption of barley either through ale or through bread. So that's the last point I want to make is this was a very big part of this civilization that wasn't in even Egypt or Greece was this focus. It was almost like a Viking or Nordic focus on drinking because you had to do it to live. And you could drink a meal as easily as you could eat one, or maybe for cheaper because you don't have to bake it. But it does show a high time preference for the people there because for either of those things, you have to wait to get them. And bread is more nutritious, but it has a lower keep time. And beer is less nutritious than bread, but it has a higher keep time. So when you're looking at the economy of the area, if you wanted to preserve your barley holdings after processing, you would process them either into beer or bread. But the so that's for the economy of the time too. You don't have a lot of ways to save your labor because both ways do spoil after a certain amount of time. So that leads to their impermanence of life.
I think that also makes the symbolism of the manna much more powerful as well. Because like if you get the bread, the barley from the ground, from the earth symbolically, the manna comes from God, and it's supposedly imperishable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, that's what we have to assume. I mean,
Well, this is the manna after the exclusion from Egypt in the Bible during the 40 days wilderness in Sinai, basically. Correct?
yeah,
Okay. Just to clarify. And yeah, it is like it is a good dichotomy where the food from the earth does expire, so you have to eat it. And so even though you're working all the time, your labors don't pay off. And to have a lasting impact, you have to build something. And you see that in the ziggurats. You see that later with the hanging gardens, which eventually fell, but stayed up for a long time. The gates of Ur during the Babylonian uh, civilization, that too.
and then that also ties directly to the bread, and then like Jesus makes the exact same analogy. Like he says, like It says, "I am the bread." So it's like it's an impermanent, and it's like from above, and it's also the bread.
Yeah, and it's also, bread's not permanent. You can't keep bread forever, but it gives life. It's a good point.
I don't know if the water has anything to do with it, because I mean, Jesus also said about the water, like drink this water and you will never have to drink again. I don't know if they had any water symbolism in Sumeria, but definitely the bread.
Water was more borderish because the at least in the epic, the Humbaba controls like robot people that build ships for him. It's really weird. They're like stone men. He calls them stone men, and they work for him, and they build him ships to trade with. And then you have which is at this time like a port, just a port city, and they never like. There's no getting on a ship and going somewhere. This isn't the Odyssey or anything like that. And then the furthest east they go is to the Indus River. So the only big thing water is here is like as a border for the story.
I, I think yeah, the Sumerians. I would say they were a long time before Jesus, but I think they would have responded well to Jesus's
Well, you have to remember the
bread
Sumerian
message.
tradition carried on to the Babylonian tradition, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace convinced the king of Babylon to let them go based on what he saw. So it wasn't like the ancient, the Old Testament Bible had no effect on like a pagan Babylonian uh, emperor. Was he emperor or was it the king? A pagan
Uh,
Babylonian king.
oh, so you're saying that like they would have? Well, I don't think Shadrach and Meshach and Abed. I don't know if they appeal to bread, but yeah, for sure.
I'm just saying like that his when he saw them in the oven, he was obviously moved, right? So it wasn't like that whatever symbolism that he saw there had no effect on him. And also, like, there's a lot of local interchangeability with the Egyptian gods and the Greek gods as well. So it wasn't like their pantheons were divorced of. Uh, I wouldn't say Christian because there obviously wasn't Christian at the time, but ancient, like Old Testament, uh, ancient Old Testament symbology. So
For that, it was like you had the magicians. The magicians, like the king wanted something impermanent. King wanted something like higher. So you could say that like the magicians that he had were like the perishable bread, and uh, the representative, Daniel, was like representing the imperishable, like bringing God to him, and he recognized it. It's like you said, he recognized like this is something special. This is something real.
yeah, definitely. So that's going to wrap it up for today. I've been Hieronymus,
I'm Kaneq Homme.
and until next time.